What's the YouTube? Dell here from Zephyr, and today I'm going to bring you 10 budget decks that are highly competitive and very good for either beginners or more advanced players to be picking up without breaking the bank and still be able to compete. Now, without wasting any further time, please smash that like button, hit that notification bell and subscribe to miss out on any more upcoming content. I'm going to dive head first into these top 10 of mine and then talk you through each individual aspect around the deck. So also mention its variety, what you can do to change it up, and then everything else in between. So we're going to be starting off with the first one being Blue Eyes White Dragon, the most recent of the structure decks that have been released in Konami, TCG. And then when you're actually looking at it, you can see the three type of criteria that I've gone for: budget, complexity, and competitiveness. So the idea behind this one is how well can the deck do on its pure level of build. So obviously the competitiveness of something like a Blue Eyes Primite will go higher, as well as the budget. So the budget will take it out of our boundary of being $100 or less. And what I'm really talking about is how you can kind of build these decks within that particular budget structure while also still compete and to what level you're looking for. So on the left hand side, you can see that I've got it numbered from 1 to 10, which obviously includes how hard it is to, how high the complexity gets, how high it can be competitive, but also the budget kind of requirements alongside it, whether it's a $10 completion, it's a $100 completion, you name it. So with the Blue Eyes, as you can see, I feel that you could build a baseline Blue Eyes deck for $60, which is very easy to do. You can, within that $60 budget, also consider stuff like the Invoked engine. You could even consider something like the Centurion engine, a Synchro route. You can also look at other different variants as well that kind of really appeal to you the most. When you're looking at it, you're going to be buying 3 Blue Eyes structure decks, which works out about $30 to $40, depending on where you're picking them up. Straight away, the benefit of something like the Blue Eyes structure deck is you're also going to get your hand traps in there as well. Then when you're kind of considering the complexity of the deck, the complexity is actually quite straightforward. You need to know exactly what card you're starting with and then the route you're trying to get to with your ultimate end field. So when you see loads of combos online, the complexity of the deck, when you compare it to some of the other decks on this list, is not that high, which is actually really good for introductory style players when you're only really needing to focus on synchro plays, link plays, and fusion plays at its most base minimum, maybe even an XYZ play if you wanted to play Indigo Eyes. It does make the deck very good for beginners, and it also makes it very cheap and easy to put together, whether you want to go for a pure Blue Eyes build that focuses only on hand traps and the Blue Eyes strategy itself, or if you wanted to involve one of those sub engines like Invoked, which has recently just got most of its pieces reprinted. You should be able to put the deck together very cheaply. In regards to its competitive nature, we already know that Blue Eyes Primite is probably the best version of the deck, but when you're putting the Primites into this particular build, straight away your budget goes from $100 to very easily double, if not more. So when you take away the Primites, what budget alternatives do you have? The answers on that one, as I've previously mentioned and shown on the channel multiple times, you can actually go through loads of different routes depending on what you want to have access to, what you want to try and protect from, and the type of play style that you want to aim for. So again, the competitiveness, depending on what type of build you go for, will adapt depending on this scale. For me, the baseline Blue Eyes, which if you're just playing pure, if you're just playing the free structure decks where it can get you, it can actually do very well. I feel that if you learn to pilot the deck correctly, you would actually be able to take on some of your local environments, depending on what your environment is kind of consistent of. I do know players at my local environment, a lot of them were on Blue Eyes. Straight away, they do incredibly well. And then the differences does come into the different variations. Stuff like Primites will do that a bit better. Sometimes having that additional support engine like the Evoked engine can help you add additional layers of protection, disruption, you name it. So that's pretty much it for the entire Blue Eyes one. This is kind of a nice introduction to show you what I'm trying to do in this particular video. I didn't want to make it anything too sparse or too different, but I also wanted to give you a little bit more information than just, here you go, here's a deck, here's the budget, blah blah. So, moving on to our next one. The next one we're going to talk about is going to be Branded. Now, Branded, I still feel is an incredibly budget-style deck. It can still be very competitive. We've seen it already at the UK Open. We've already seen it with other pilots as well, doing incredibly well with this deck. And when you look at the budget to complete a Branded deck right now, it's not that crazy expensive. Yes, of course, Grand Grignol can start adding little bits of money into it, but the fact of the matter is, most of these cards have been reprinted recently. The competitive nature, again, as well, I might be being a tad bit harsh on this one, putting it at a 6. But quite like Blue Eyes, it will definitely be able to take on your local environment. It will definitely be able to cause your local environment some issues. And its overall complexity isn't that complicated. You know exactly what you need to do. And what I really do like about Branded Duelists right now is that they have found the best way to navigate around with only having Branded Fusion to 1. Branded Fusion kind of becomes more of an additional benefit than it does an actual core staple focal point of the deck. Yes, of course, one of its strongest elements is to either IDO lock your opponent or pretty much just lock your opponent down with a Sanctifier Dragon. That's when you can kind of go down the little less of a complexity route, but you still need to be able to navigate around to it to get to it completely. Now, obviously, the more and more you play it, the more and more you test it, the more and more you learn, that's when you're going to be able to get a bit more advantage with the particular deck. We've already seen a Field Breaker version of this deck that just utilizes Super Polys, Triple Tactics Thrust, you name it, a little bit more expensive Field Breakers, rather than just their like absolutely insane amount of hand traps in the current format of being like 15 hand traps plus, which I really do feel goes into the benefit of the branded strategy. As I mentioned as well, budget, again, depending on what you want to add to it. And when we're talking about these decks in general, we're talking about the baseline, how much it would cost you to get the baseline version of the deck with maybe 1 or 2 upgrades or additions to it. When you're looking at the Blue Eye Structure deck itself, that's already reprinted most of the hand trap staples you may need or might be looking for in regards to this particular build. So then when you're talking about budget as well, all you need to do is pick up the pieces of the stuff like the Branded Fusions, the Albions, the Alubas, and of course, everything else in between, like Fusion Duplication, Quests, Cartesias, which have all had multiple prints themselves, so it don't make it too crazy expensive. And when you're trying to look at different markets where people go to buy cards, obviously you do have some third-party sellers. You can also have your friends at locals that might be able to sort you out of a deck core as well. And then the versatility of a deck like Branded does give you a few more different options, depending on which route you'd want to go. Whether you'd want to go first control with an IDO lock, whether you want to go second Field Breaker, then IDO lock, or just OTK Mirror Jade, whether you want to go with Super Poly, you have a lot of creative freedom with this deck as well. That does mean that it is very, very competitive. It does have slight bits of complexity because you do need to make sure you know exactly what type of hand traps you're trying to navigate through, but that really kind of falls under every deck in general, that you want to be able to learn it as best you possibly can. But it's one of them ones that, again, a new player coming into Branded would not be that too overpowered with what they need to try and do, what they need to try and achieve. And once you kind of get the knack of where you're trying to go, it is one of them ones that is a little bit more straightforward. Again, this will make more sense when we talk on one of the other decks later on in this list, which kind of comes down to mandatory effects, optional effects, chain links, and everything else in between. So moving on to our next deck, let's talk about Cristrons. Now, Cristrons is another one. Unlike Branded and Blue Eyes, which both came out in a structure themselves, Cristrons actually just become more budget over time, with more and more of its pieces being reprinted in easily accessible kind of sets. So the last 2 cards that got reprinted was the Citri and the Sulfurneer, which obviously both came in OTS 26. Its more recent support also came out in Supreme Darkness, just definitely took this deck up another level. The competitiveness of this deck, again, is very, very good, and you could arguably say that it goes more up towards the 7 and the 8 level, depending on what variant you are playing. So again, the baseline that I'm looking at with this particular deck, when it's got a $60 budget with a level 6, and its complexity is about a level 5, and then its competitiveness is a level 6, is when you're looking at it pure. Now, as a pure one, it does have a bit more frailties and a bit more weaknesses. Stuff like Artifact Lancier running around can cause it a few little issues. And then when you're trying to take into account Draw and Lockbird, that's when you're going to get the benefit of being able to play sub-engines such as the Kashtira package, the Adventure package, or if you really wanted to push the boat out, you could also consider the Azamina engine as well. When you're starting to involve stuff like the Azamina engine, that's when your budget will start to crawl up through the roof a little bit, and that's why we've tried to keep it around this mid-range point, because from this point here, it's up to you if you want to invest that additional $40 and maybe get the Kashtira package. If you want to invest another $10 and go for the Adventure package, it really does then come down to you. The complexity will then adapt depending on what version you go for. If you go for the Azamina version, your complexity will be a little bit higher than if you're going down the Kashtira route. What you need to remember when you're trying to play stuff like your Speedroid Terratop or your Kashtira engine is you're trying to work your way into the Cherubini in order to send either your Smygar or, in the form of the Adventure version, being able to send your Water Enchantress to then set you up with that nice Omni Negate. The biggest weakness of something like that is you are walking headfirst into something like Draw and Lockbird, which is a little bit more prominent in the format. And as soon as we go past Alliance Insight, that's when something like a Artifact Lancer will also be a little bit more prominent in the meta, and that might give you a little bit of a stumbling block for the Cristrons. Also, you need to take into mind that more of the budget will come from the extra deck cards that haven't been recently reprinted. Stuff like FA Dawn Dragstar still demands about a $7 to $10 price range, depending on where you're looking and what you're trying to get from it as well. Unlike it being all in one structure, again, you'll need to go and pick up the pieces all over the place. But if you do have a couple of friends online or just a couple of friends at the local environment, they might even have a full core ready to go for you. So again, you could probably offer them around about the $60 mark and you'd probably get everything you need, maybe even get an Adventure Engine package thrown in with it as well. It can get more complex depending on what variant you go for, and of course it can get more competitive depending on what variant you go for, but the more and more you learn the deck, the higher and higher the ceiling will become with its competitiveness. The deck itself is very versatile. You just need to know what cards you can activate if you get interacted with at a specific point, and how you can adapt on the fly with a deck like this. Moving into our next one, so another one going back to structure decks, we're going to be talking about Fire Kings. So as you can kind of see with the Fire Kings one, the budget has gone up a little bit more. This is currently sitting at like a level 8 or a $80 budget price. And the reason for that, of course, is Volcanics. Volcanics did not come in the structure deck, so it does demand a bit more of a price increase. Its complexity is relatively straightforward, as it takes away the need of an extra deck massively. It doesn't need to rely on that one. It's a very good meta call that allows you to play through certain hand trap interactions. It does get hurt by Draw Not Bad a little bit if you don't play it correctly, but then it doesn't really worry about cards that will become staple in the side deck, stuff like Artifact Lancer. It doesn't really worry about much of the Molchummies, whether that be Meowis, Perulia, or Fluoros. So it really does kind of come down to that you have the ability to navigate around them should you need to. And the one that's probably going to be used the least in the upcoming meta, being Perulia, is probably the one that will hurt the Fire King strategy the most. But even then, you're able to hold back your resources so you don't need to like lean into your opponent's Perulia. Its competitive nature, we've already seen how good this deck can be. I've seen a lot of people taking it to regionals. We've already seen Dinkabui, who has taken it to 2 YCS tops, or he took it to YCS Birmingham top, and then also took it to the Italian Open top as well, or winning the actual event. The difference is you can't always compare Dinkabui to every average player out there, because Dinkabui is an incredibly skilled duelist. So what you do need to still take into account is that the deck does have a very high competitive ceiling. It just comes down to the duelists behind it learning it as much as they possibly can. And again, you can see the complexity of this deck is relatively balanced. You just need to know when you're triggering and remembering to trigger stuff like your Volcanics, your Ponix, and of course your Barong if you are choosing to play those, when you're going to be using your Kirins, how you can utilize the field without needing to run through the extra deck, how you can play around certain interactions if you do get drolled, if you do get hand trapped by a Perulia, for example. It gives you a little bit more to work with, but the deck is still incredibly strong, very, very easy to pick up. The budget is not crazy because you can rely on just one Volcanics rather than 3, and then that starts opening up the door to allowing you to play some other supporting engines or some other supporting cards in the form of your own Fluoruses by being able to pick them up thanks to the Rarity Collection 4 Stampede reprints. I already do feel that this is one of the highest competitive value decks, and it's already been proven that it can take some regional tops. Like a regional I went to the other weekend, Fire Kings was the one that ended up winning it. So it kind of shows that if you know the deck inside and out and you do know how to navigate around the current format that you're in, the deck can seriously put in a lot of work for you. Moving on to the next one, and the next one we're going to be talking about is Labyrinth. Now again, this one I've kind of balanced it a little bit down, and the reason I've balanced it down is because its complexity can be a little bit higher depending on the way you want to take it. Its budget can range from anywhere from $60 to $70 to $80 depending on what you're trying to get access to with inside the deck. If you're considering stuff like your Chaos Angel, if you're considering stuff more so for the extra deck to provide you with that little bit more of aggression, that's when your budget will start to creep up. Its complexity can be relatively straightforward and simple if you just wanted to play full-on out Labyrinth control, and that's when you lean into your stuff like your Transaction Rollback, which has just had a recent reprint in the Rarity Collection 4 Stampede, alongside leading it into other floodgates you might have access to, and then kind of going down the basic route. It can get more complex if you start taking into account like the Transaction Cannon, the one that requires you to do a lot of maths in order to kind of break your opponent's field apart. But then, of course, it can also increase its competitive structure, which is why this one sits at a 6, because I feel that at a base level, if you are someone new to the game and you decide to go for Labyrinth, it might get a little bit overwhelming because it's one of them decks that if you don't learn the strategies and don't understand the way that it wants to play, you might fall out of love with it a lot quicker than you really would want to. And it's kind of one of the ones that you need to, I wouldn't say it's the best one for a beginner coming back to the game. I feel that's when you're going to be looking at structured X ones and going, right, well, I'm not the biggest fan of combo, but I understand some of the ways that the deck plays in general, and then I'm going to move on to Labyrinth. So its complexity is probably a little bit higher than that, but again, it kind of comes down to the route you want to take it. If you want to kind of limit its competitive nature and just go for an all-out control style version of the deck, that's where the complexity comes down. If you increase its complexity and you increase your understanding of the deck, then straight away the competitive nature of the deck as well will also increase. We've already seen that when it got to a top cut at one of the most recent YCSs in America, but then you also need to take into account that that individual player would have been playing this deck inside and out and knew when to interact with his opponents, when not to interact, and kind of get the most out of the deck. So like I said, these are all looking at these as a base introduction version. At a base introduction version, you can keep the complexity down, you can you keep the competitiveness down, and the more and more you learn, the more and more you develop, the more and more the deck adapts to yourself, and then that's when you're going to be able to get the most out of it and increase its complexity and its competitive nature. Moving on to one that is a lot more, like this one should definitely be a lot less on the complexity. This should probably be along the lines of a 4. Its budget is about $60, and again, you can put it up or lower depending on what you're trying to go for. If you want to make sure you're able to play all of the Go Second cards in the form of the Meowist, the Perulia, and the Fluros, of course your budget will go through the roof. But Millennium Exodia is a very, very good aggressive deck. It has the ability to OTK your opponent out of nowhere, and making sure that your Millennium Unk resolves where at all possible and giving you the most ways possible to get access to it is definitely where the deck can come out swinging. Its complexity is relatively simple because you're not really doing anything or any combos that are absolutely crazy. All you're trying to do is get to your Millennium Unk, get to your Exodia, and then one punch OTK your opponent. So that's why I say the complexity on the actual graphics shown, which I will change in post, but just so you know exactly what I'm talking to, is probably along the lines of maybe a 3 to a 4, because I feel that you could adapt it to make it a little bit more complex if you wanted to, but you kind of just keep it very simple and you just play field breakers, or you can play hand traps to really slow your opponent down, get to your Millennium Unk, push through for the OTK, move into game 2, and then the complexity then starts to shift on whether you feel that you're going to be able to have to adapt to going first, or whether you're just going to stick it out and go second. In the current competitive landscape, you're probably going to be still better off going second, and that's when your opponent might give you the benefit of the doubt and say, right, okay, well, I'll let them go second and try and stop the OTK, and that's probably where your hand traps will come in and put a lot more work than your field breakers and really, really slow the deck down. Its competitive nature can still really do a lot. The issue with this deck is if it does get stopped to get a Millennium Unk, or Millennium Unk gets negated or stopped in any way whatsoever, and they can't get to the ultimate Exodia, that's when you're going to really start to struggle. It's one of them ones that you ideally want to go for the one-shot OTK, and if you are dragged into the grind game, that's where the deck can start to burn itself down, where you're going to be paying most of your life points, and when you can't finish the OTK off, that's when the deck can really start to struggle. So its competitive level is right within the middle. It's kind of a nice little balance. Its budget isn't anything too crazy. It's very simple for a new player to be coming into this, and I feel it's one of the most simple decks around because you don't need to worry about any crazy combos. You don't need to worry about any crazy outs. You just need to know that your Heart of the Blue Eyes, your Millennium Shield, or your Sanganjin will lead you into your Millennium Unk, which is going to lead you to your Exodia to push for that OTK, and you need to kind of navigate around going in through stuff like Nightmare Phoenix to deal with any opponent's back row, or you need to be working into Harpy's Feather Duster, Triple Tactics Thrust if you want to go for the field breakers, or you just use the hand traps to really slow your opponent building their deck, and as long as they leave a monster on the field that can get punched by the Exodia or just the Exodia attacking directly, you're pushing through for an easy 8k OTK. Moving on to the next one we're going to talk about is Ubell. Now, this is Ubell without the Fiendsmith. This will still involve Unchained, even though they've gone up a little bit in price. But the Unchained engine itself isn't crazy expensive or crazy demanding on the deck itself. You'll probably be looking at 1 Yama, 1 Shavara, and 1 Rage at the base minimum, and then you can start to adapt it a little bit more. Now, its complexity of this deck can be kept very simple, but I do feel its complexity does go up quite a bit when you start adding in Fiendsmiths, but just as its baseline as well, its complexity can be a little bit more than the Exodia, for the pure fact that you're trying to do more combos. You need to know exactly where to start, where to go through, and then quite like some of the other decks on this list, you need to know how you can adapt the best possible outcome depending on which hand trap you get interacted with. Its budget isn't too crazy because obviously it's come out of the competitive landscape quite a bit right now. You should be able to pick up Nightmare Thrones and everything else a lot cheaper. What I do like about the Fiendsmith-less version is the fact of the matter is that we do feel that Fiendsmith will get hit on an upcoming Forbidden Unlimited list. Obviously, it's going to be safe for the next couple of months unless they drop an emergency ban list. But the idea behind this one is you can kind of pre-prep your deck ready for if the Fiendsmith engine does get hit, you're already good to go with your Ubells, as the overall cool cards involving Ubell should not be getting hit. What I like about the budget version is it does allow you to utilize Super Poly, and I also feel that Ubell have one of the best Super Poly targets in the entire game when you're being able to look at the Ubell fusion monster that just requires Ubell and then any monster on the field. It means you can completely clear your opponent's entire field and even get some burn damage on top for a time con option. As I mentioned previously, the complexity will adapt and will shift depending on where you're kind of looking at it and the type of strategies you want to go for it. I do feel that it has ways to play through multiple hand traps. It has ways to play through multiple interactions. Obviously, the Fiendsmiths do give it an extra layer of resilience against those particular hand traps, but I also do feel that it's one of them slept on decks that a lot of people do get caught out by how incredibly powerful Nightmare Throne is, but alongside obviously Nightmare Pain, which is the one that basically redirects all damage to your opponent when they are attacking a Ubell and then forcing your opponent to attack said Ubells, so it does make it a little bit harder to deal with. The fact that Phantom of Ubell is one of the best counters for this particular deck in order to line it up with a layer of protection is very good, and I feel that in a pure version what you're trying to do a little bit more times than not is make sure you recycle that Phantom of Ubell so you can utilize it multiple times even though it is limited in the current TCG format. I can't wait to kind of put my Ubell back together. I really do feel that it relies a little bit too much, and I feel that a lot of people, when they look at Ubell, kind of allow it to rely too much on the Fiend Swift engine, but I feel that there is still a very good, very powerful, and very consistent deck there without the Fiend Swift engine, and that's when you take away that Fiend Swift engine within the deck that you do lose a little bit of versatility, but you also then increase your capabilities of playing cards that your opponent will not expect in the form of stuff like Super Polymerization and other particular hand traps as well. Moving on to our top three, well, not even top three, like our penultimate three, let's talk about Tempai. Now, this is specifically going to be Tempai Sky Strikers. Now, the reason that I'm calling it Tempai Sky Strikers when it should technically also be called Tempai Breaker is the fact that being able to utilize the Sky Striker engine with the Tempai strategy allows them to increase their consistency and ability to break an opponent's field. You're ideally wanting to lean into going second a bit more with the Tempais, but what also allows you to get the benefit out of the Sky Strikers is that because you don't need to commit any of your monsters to the field yet, and you're trying to get to that Pydra, that Chandra, that Sangan Summoning or Sangan Kaiman, the ability of being able to utilize your Sky Striker engages and Widow Anchors allows you to kind of pull apart some of your opponent's interactions. Like your opponent might be tempted to Ash Blossom your engages rather than worrying about your Sangan Summoning, which can also be one of those game winners for you. And then of course, if you are able to get other field breakers into play, whether you are utilizing stuff like Ultimate Slayer, whether you're utilizing stuff like Raigekis, Dark Holes, Harpy's Feather Dusters, Trill Tactic Talents, you've got such an array of field breaking cards that you're basically utilizing that spell effect, the draw effect, and consistency effect of your Sky Strikers to combo off with your all-out aggression of the Tempai Dragons. Once you've utilized the Sky Strikers to pull apart all of your opponent's interactions or their particular field, that's when your Tempais are going to come out to play, and that's when they're going to be able to very easily push for an OTK, unless your opponent is already pre-prepared and are holding back an Ash Blossom for that Sangan Summoning, or an interaction for that Kaiman, or of course, interaction for your Pydra, which will lead you into your Chandra and everything else in between. So what I'm trying to say with this one is do not wipe off Tempai or turn your back to it. The deck is incredibly strong. I do feel that the budget is very, very cheap as well, as a lot of people are trying to get rid of their Tempai decks thanks to the most recent Forbidden Unlimited list, or the fact that they haven't really changed much. The overall complexity isn't too much. You don't need to do any crazy combos apart from learning the basic Tempai strategy combos yourself. It does kind of come down to like damage step and activations during those particular points and declaration, which is when you're going to be able to master the deck and give your opponent very little chance to be able to respond. And that's when, of course, the strikers kind of come into play to help you kind of pick this field apart and go from there. I do feel that it has a very high competitive ceiling. Of course, the biggest weakness with a deck like this is its consistency. And the fact of the matter is, when you are looking at Draw and Lockbird running around, that can really stump the deck when they want to be activating Sky Striker Engage multiple turns. It's one of the ones that if your opponent does not see Draw and Lockbird, you are pretty much free to run rampant. But if they do see Draw and Lockbird, it will really slow your plays down. And you're hoping that you have hard opened up Pydra, Chandra, or of course a route to Kaiman as well, or Summoning, because that's what's going to lead you to the OTK capabilities, and once you get to that position there, you should be able to finish the game off. The budget isn't anything too crazy, neither is the complexity, and this is actually a really, really good introductory deck for you. However, I do feel that if a new player is coming into this, there are other decks that I would probably advise them to look at. Stuff like Fire Kings, stuff like Blue Eyes as well, might be higher up the list just because you can get everything in one place and it's a little bit more simpler to introduce yourself to. But if you want to be all out aggression and always go second, you're going to be looking at your Millennium Exodias or of course your Tempai Strikers, which will really give you an edge. Moving on to our penultimate deck on this list. The penultimate deck is Mermount Atlanteans. Now, I feel that this is probably the most complex deck on this entire list, and the reason for the complexity being so high on this particular deck is that you have a lot of effects to remind yourself of, and if you've used them or not used them. Remembering that some of the Mermount and Atlantean cards are mandatory, so you have to use them when you trigger them. They're not like, oh cool, I won't use it now, I'll use it later. It's one of the ones that if you activate it, you have to use it in the form of like the graveyard effects of stuff like your Neptibus. That's one very important thing to remember. And some of the effects are even mandatory, so they need to be the lower chain links as you're trying to build up. And it's making sure you remember all of these effects, because if you get caught out without activating one of your mandatory effects, you could get hit by a judge call, and that's something you really don't want to worry about. Its budget isn't that crazy thanks to the most recent reprints of Rarity Collection 4 Stampede, as well as Rarity Collection 3 Bonanza, because that's where we got reprints of Neptibus and all of the most of the other Mermail cards as well. There isn't anything that massively outstanding in its entire strategy, as everything else from Rise of the Duelist, just trying to get the right set correctly on that one, isn't anything too crazy, and Supreme Darkness being Poseidra isn't that crazy expensive either. They're about £5 to £7 a copy, so you should be able to pick them up relatively easy. The deck's competitiveness has definitely dropped. It's gone from being like a top 4 contender at YCS Birmingham to possibly being a definite local contender, definite local winner, but it can also cause a stir at the regional environment and maybe a little bit higher, depending on how well you have mastered the deck. At current, the strategy is to end your field by taking away 2 cards from your opponent's hand permanently, with the option of a possible third if you do go down the Trishula Ice Barrier Dragon route. But then on top of that as well, you should be ending on a barrier statue of Torrents, which is the water one, which basically says to your opponent you can't special summon except waters, which in this current format, unless you are facing the mirror match, you should be able to lock that turn down and lock that duel down moving into games 2 and 3. And that's when you need to try and navigate around stuff like Draw and Lockbird while still being able to produce an end field, which is still very easily doable. You just need to be able to navigate the deck as correctly as you possibly can, and that's why the complexity issue kind of comes up, is you need to know exactly how to play around it, when to interact with your opponent. And if you do hard open up a Mooning Glacier and your opponent has hand traps you once or twice, it's only going to make your job a little bit easier to take away those resources from your opponent, and that's really when you're going to be standing out shining. Now, obviously, with the Mermount Atlantean deck, it is a resource management style deck, so it's not as easy as setting 5 passing and then controlling bit by bit. It's one of the ones where you want to take away your opponent's resources, and in pretty typical fashion, you want to drown out their access to their deck. You want to make sure that they are left with as minimal resources as possible, while also kind of making sure that your field is as powerful as possible, while they're not going to be able to get past your particular lineup without a very direct out, where some duelists are playing and some duelists aren't playing, so it's something you do need to keep in mind. Moving on to our final deck. Now, this is arguably the most competitive deck, but I also feel that its complexity is also up there as well, and that is the Momentos. So originally, the Memento budget was relatively quite cheap once the Rarity Collection 4 had been released, because that's when we got reprints of Bone Party and Anguish, which were the most expensive cards pre-ban list. Pre-reprints as well. The combined creation, luckily, is about a £25 card, but luckily for that one, you only need to play one of it. Everything else within the art type is a little bit cheaper, as a little bit lower rarity. The only ones that you need to keep an eye on is the Tatsunoko and, of course, the Darkblade, because they are super rares that have only had 1 print, and they're about £5 a copy and rising a little bit as well, so that will push your budget up a little bit higher. Its competitive nature of this deck is pretty much unarguable. We've seen it in the most recent YCS Houston, where it ended up taking first place. We also see that it took first place at YCS Mexico the other day as well. It is one of them decks that can be very, very complex. It can be built on a tidy budget, but it can also break the budget if you are going to involve the Fiendsmiths. When you do look at the version that won Houston, you'd actually see that it wasn't playing the Fiendsmith, but it was playing the Goblins, and the Goblins were a very good meta call to deal with the Ryziels, and it kind of opens up that space within the deck to start utilising cards like Super Polymerization, or just either Field Breakers, or just ways to counteract hand traps that may interact with you, and it's one of them ones that not a lot of people are fully versed about facing this particular deck right now. It is one of them ones where, as a pilot, you will need to learn it inside and out. It does have some very integral combos that you need to learn of how you can adapt, depending on where they're trying to interact with you with as well. But if you are able to go off unanswered, or even if you are able to navigate their interactions correctly, it can lead you to a very devastating end field that your opponent will struggle to break and pull apart, and ultimately end up leading you to the win. So the amount of work you put into the Memento kind of lineup, you'll get that back tenfold if you're able to learn it inside and out and navigate correctly. Keeping in mind, you'll want to be looking at the complexity and the competitiveness of this deck is definitely up there. It's one of the ones where the risk and reward of working out the particular deck lines and strategies for the format will yield you very, very good outcomes as well. So that's it for our 10 decks. Hopefully I've given you as much information as possible. I've tried to give you all of these little bits of breakdown, my own personal opinions on these decks as well, just so you have a bit of an idea of the way that these work, what you're trying to be looking for, and whether they're a good introductory deck or not. With something like the Mementos, I wouldn't advise it as being your first deck back into the game, but if it's one of them decks you're like, oh, I quite like the artwork, I quite like the design, and I'm willing to put in the work, then you can start looking at Mementos, or of course you can start looking at the Mermount Atlanteans, and that's when you can start to put your efforts into the overall deck building, the combos and the strategies behind it, and you'll be able to reap the rewards, whether it be at your local environment, whether it be at the final quarter of the competitive season, working to try and get your invite and then moving from there. Anyway, I hope this video has been informative. If you do have any questions, by all means, please put in the comments down below. I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. Let me know what your best budget picks are for this particular format and go from there. For now, as absolutely always, stay safe and, of course, happy dueling.